majority of the voting public that it would baakanya lefatshe, that is fix the country, upon it being re-voted into power, Mr. Speaker. The overwhelming majority of voters believed that something had gone akilter and that fixing was needed. We won the elections on the promise of righting things. Of course, we also made the other obvious promises. We promised schools, we promised roads, hospitals, bridges, youth unemployment. But the most fundamental promise, the promise that all other promises were anchored on, was a promise that we would restore good governance and the rule of law. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, the President has at paragraph 139 under the topic governance, peace, and security restate the promise in the following words, and I quote, Mr. Speaker, with your permission, open quotes. Our development as a country is premised on participatory democracy, the rule of law, transparency and accountability, public safety and protection, as well as international relations and cooperation, end quote. Mr. Speaker, perhaps we should first agree on what constitutes good governance and the rule of law. Mr. Speaker, I believe we can all agree that governance means the process of decision-making and the process by which decisions are implemented or not implemented, as the case may be. In Botswana, we speak of tsamaiso. In this context, I'm talking about governance of a nation, of a country, of a state, tsamaiso ya lefatshe. A few examples of governance, Mr. Speaker. The processes of initiating and prosecuting a criminal case. The processes of appointing or removing public officers or officers of state-owned entities. The processes of procurement of or disposal of goods and services, and the processes of termination of services. The process of blacklisting companies and barring them from trading with government. The processes of finding fault with anyone or absolving anyone of any fault in any setting under any circumstances. Mr. Speaker, we promised that we would do all these things. We promised good governance. Mr. Speaker, we can all agree that good governance can be measured by the following factors. 1, the rule of law. 2, participation. 3, transparency. 4, responsiveness. 5, consensus orientation. 6, equity and inclusiveness. 7, efficiency. And 8, accountability. This then is what we promised the nation in 2019, that we will run this country with decision-making and decision implementation processes with the full participation of the nation's citizens in a manner that promotes consensus building on key issues while being transparent, responsive, efficient, equitable, and inclusive, with the rule of law prevailing, and lastly, with accountability mechanism being firmly in place. Mr. Speaker, the nation may wish to be reminded, what did we mean by the rule of law? What did we mean by accountability? What did we mean by ho baakanya lefatshe? Mr. Speaker, when we promised this nation the rule of law, we meant that we would run this country not through whims and fancies, not through force or fear, not through threats and intimidation, but rather that all persons, institutions, and entities would be accountable to laws that are 1, publicly promulgated, 2, equally enforced, and lastly, consistent with international norms and standards. In other words, we promised the nation that no one would be above the law. We promised that no institution would disregard its mandate as set out in the laws that set it up or regulate it. We promised that neither in the letter of the law nor in the implementation of same would we allow anyone or institution to operate in a manner that undermines and or assails 8 key factors of good governance set out above. To allow that, Mr. Speaker, would be an affront on good governance and the rule of law. Mr. Speaker, it is my view that In the case of the Directorate of Intelligence Services, commonly known as the DIS, we have failed to deliver on this promise. Let me repeat, Mr. Speaker. We, as government, all three arms, have failed in delivering good governance in respect of the DIS. This failure, I have said, is so critical that it threatens the security of every individual in this country, mine and yours, indeed, included as well as that of the state itself. Mr. Speaker, I assert that we are on a precipice, and unless and until we have the courage to pull back, history will judge every single one of us who has the education and information to understand where we stand at this moment very harshly. Before I describe the nature and extent, before I describe the nature and extent of the failure as I see it, let me start, Mr. Speaker, by reminding all of us what creature was actually created by the law that went into effect on the 1st of April 2008. Mr. Speaker, let us start with the law that sets up this institution so that we can examine its mandate and the oversight mechanisms intended to ensure its effectiveness. The DIS is a creature of statute, having been established by the Intelligence and Security Services Act of 2008. What is little known is that the Act did not just create the DIS. It further that it did not actually create an independent and self-regulating entity. It did not do that. The Act that created the DIS, in addition, created a network of entities which were meant to oversee, to direct, to regulate and guide the DIS. These mechanisms include: 1, the Central Intelligence Committee, or the CIC. The membership of this committee are as follows: the President, the Vice President, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of Defense, the Minister of Presidential Affairs, the Attorney General, the Police Commissioner, the Deputy Police Commissioner, the PSP, the Commander of the BDF, the Deputy Commander of the Police, the DG of the DIS, the Deputy Director of the DIS, the Assistant Chief of Staff of the Ministry of Intelligence. This committee has 13 members, and only 2 of these are actually from the DIS. What is the function of this particular committee? It is to guide the Directorate generally on matters relating to national security and intelligence interests, and to advise the President on policy and policy formulation. Then we have another institution created by the same Act, is the National Intelligence Community. Section 27 says this particular community shall be by the advisory body to the Director General. So the Director General is advised by this committee. It's got 8 members, and the members are as follows, Mr. Speaker. The DG himself, the Deputy DG of the GIS, the head of the Crime Intelligence Bureau, the Assistant Chief of Staff of Military Intelligence, the PS Foreign Affairs, the Assistant Director of DCEC, the Chief Immigration Officer, and Commissioner of Births. What are the functions of this particular body? It is to review and coordinate intelligence, to ensure that there is interagency exchange of intelligence, and to coordinate the activities as may be directed by the DG. Then we have another body called the Intelligence and Security Council. This one has fewer members. The members are the PSP, the Attorney General, the DG of DIS, and the Deputy DG. And the functions are to review. Mr. Speaker, I hope I can still be heard. I see that we have, Mr. Speaker, can you confirm that you can hear me? Mr. Speaker, I can see that you cannot hear me. I don't see any response. Have you on the main that? Can you hear me, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, I'm going to stop my video to promote better internet. I was told, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I was on the third entity, the Intelligence and Security Council. The membership are the PSP, the Attorney General, the DG of the DIS, and the Deputy DG of the DIS. And the functions are as follows: to review intelligence policies, and activities, and to examine the expenditure, administration of the DIS. It is this council that recommends candidates to the president for appointment and the terms thereof to the position of DG. So this is a very powerful entity, Mr. Speaker. Then there's another entity, the tribunal, under the same act. Members are a High Court judge and 2 other persons. And the functions of this particular committee, of this particular entity, is to receive complaints from anyone who is aggrieved by an act or omission of an officer of the DIS. And the decisions of this tribunal can be appealed directly to the Court of Appeal. So it's actually a court at par with the High Court. Then the last one, Mr. Speaker, is the Parliamentary Committee on Intelligence and Security, which is detailed, provided for at Section 38. This one's got 9 members of Parliament, the composition of which shall reflect the ruling stroke opposition membership of Parliament. The functions to examine the expenditure, administration, and policy of the Directorate. So 9 members of Parliament are enjoined to examine the expenditure, the administration, and policy of the Directorate. These, Mr. Speaker, are not secret entities. These are, to use the language of good governance, entities created by law that was publicly promulgated by this very Parliament, whose functions are spelled out. The expectations being that the implementation of the law would be fairly and equally enforced, and that there would be compliance with international norms and standards. In fact, Mr. Speaker, I do not believe that there's any other agency in government with this kind of oversight mechanisms in place, especially spelled out by the legislature. It is not uncommon for government entities to hide behind or to be protected by the claim that they are independent, as if independence, whatever its meaning, is an excuse for not following good governance and rule of law principles. In the case of the DIS, Mr. Speaker, the claim of independence cannot even be asserted with any seriousness. The DIS, in terms of the law that created it, is open to oversight, to direction, to guidance, to advice and scrutiny by the President, the Vice President, 3 cabinet ministers, the Attorney General, the Chief of Police, the Chief of the Army, a High Court judge, 9 members of Parliament, the PSP, at least 2 permanent secretaries, the DCEC, BERS, the head of immigration, the military intelligence, the crime intelligence bureau, and that, Mr. Speaker, is not even the complete list. It is of relevance, Mr. Speaker, that the act creating the DIS did not only create this elaborate network of oversight mechanisms, it also provides as follows. And I quote, Mr. Speaker, with your permission, as Section 5, subsection 2. With your permission, Mr. Speaker.
Do you quote or remember?
Okay, open quotes. The Directorate shall not, in the performance of its functions, be influenced by considerations not relevant to such functions, and no act shall be performed that could give rise to any reasonable suspicion that the Directorate is concerned in furthering, protecting, or undermining the interests of any particular section of the population or of any political party or other organization in Botswana, end quote. Mr. Speaker, may I again quote Section 7D of the same Act? With your permission, Mr. Speaker.
Do you quote or remember?
Open quotes. The Director General shall take all reasonable steps to ensure that the actions of the Directorate are limited to those necessary for the proper performance of its functions under this Act or any other written law, and that no information is gathered by the Directorate except as may be necessary for the proper performance of its functions, end quote. But how, Mr. Speaker, and why have we failed in delivering our good governance in respect of the DIS, one may ask. Mr. Speaker, we as a government have failed to influence the public's perception of the DIS from the get-go. The public has always viewed the DIS as a monster. We fear it, and that became a self-fulfilling prophecy. We speak about it in whispers, We expect that they are listening to us as we converse on what should be private phones. Good governance is about transparency, Mr. Speaker, and there is absolutely very little, if anything, transparent about the DIS. We have allowed the DIS, Mr. Speaker, to operate outside the law. Absolutely no one, not even a judge, not even the highest judge in this country, has the powers or should have the powers to, for example, direct the hiring or the firing of anyone outside legally laid down procedures, or direct the blacklisting or inclusion of any one company outside legally laid down procedures. Listen to private conversations outside legally laid down procedures. Arrest, detain, search, and generally interfere with personal liberties outside legally laid out procedures. And lastly, procure property with government funds or otherwise use government resources without reference to relevant laws and procedures. Mr. Speaker, we all must care because when the DIS flouts the law, you and I pay the price, monetary otherwise. Botswana is suffering reputational harm. Individuals suffer loss of liberty. Individuals have to pay unnecessary legal fees. Individuals who have been suspended or fined unfairly suffer loss of income. The state has to settle cases that should never have been initiated in the first place. The state has to pay legal fees because there's always a lawyer keen to argue a case, any case, regardless of how ridiculously unjustifiable it is. Even this constant surveillance is costing somebody money. Imagine the loss even to companies, phone companies, because nobody's using their phones. People speak in code. Botswana conversations must be the most boring conversations in the world because everybody expects that they are being listened to. The DIS, Mr. Speaker, is an institution like any other, created by law and with functions spelled out in the law. It has absolutely no mandate to disregard the law. It is doing that because it can. And it can because we are failing in our collective duties to rein it in. What can be done? I offer, Mr. Speaker, the following solutions. First, the DIS must be subjected to a commission of inquiry, which inquiry will look into its policies, its regulations, activities, etc., with a view to examine the reason for its derailment from its core functions and the failings of the current accountability mechanisms. Mr. Speaker, I will not yield for any clarifications. I will take those at the end of my presentation, Mr. Speaker, if my fellow... Yes, thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.
The President, as the chair of the Central Intelligence Committee, must get full and honest advice on what is needed for this committee to deliver on its mandate. This is the one committee that can fix what is happening at the DIS. 3. Honorable Salshando, in his capacity as a leader of the opposition, should review his position on the opposition's membership of the Parliamentary Committee on Intelligence and Security. The nation urgently needs 9 members of this House to examine the expenditure, the administration, and the policies of the DIS. 4. The Minister of Presidential Affairs must mount a national campaign to educate the public on the law governing the DIS. Citizens must know that in terms of the law, what this agency can or cannot do. It is the country's duty to dispel, it's the ministry's duty to dispel the current myth that the DIS is independent, is unregulated, and is above the law. The Attorney General must do his job. He sits in 2 of the critical oversight entities of the DIS. So must the PSP. All members of the public with complaints against the DIS should lodge them with the tribunal. We can only appreciate the extent and scale of the problem if members of the public come forward. I call upon all lawyers, or every lawyer with a conscience, to offer free legal advice to complainants. The DCC must assert its authority and stop allowing itself to be undermined by and bullied by the DIS. State-owned enterprises and independent departments must stand up to the DIS bullying and must put in place procedures and processes that push back at DIS interference. I have in mind BERS, CEDA, NDB, BDC, PPABD. These are among the ones I have in mind. They must stop being intimidated by the current practice by DIS of producing badly drafted, sorry excuses of intelligence briefs used to direct decisions. The DPP's office must re-evaluate its relationship with the DIS with a view to ensuring that it can trust the evidence brought to it both in property value and the manner that it was collected. Allegations of fabricated evidence and forged search warrants must strike fear in the hearts of all who believe in the rule of law. Journalists must refuse to be used as agents masquerading as sources. Individual DIS agents, police officers, public servants must stand up and have the courage to do what is right. Say no to acts that you know are illegal or immoral. If you don't, you are going to be left to face the consequence as an individual. Kgabo only knows it is a matter of time. To the President, I say, demand the truth from your ministers, the Attorney General, the Commissioner of Police, and the PSP. They know, sir, that we are on the edge of darkness. And if we don't pull back now, our grandchildren will spit on our graves. To the judiciary, I ask, where is the jurisprudence on the DIS? What is the guidance on lawful searches and seizures, on detentions, on access to legal representation? I do not want to even imagine that our judiciary is as petrified of the DIS as many of us are. I'm going to assume that no case has been presented that calls for the necessary direction from our courts. But I want to suggest that the DIS is mentioned so frequently before the courts at the moment that a more careful look at its activities is called for from the judiciary. Ministers and members of parliament, myself included, must stop treating the DIS like an omnipotent organization, which is the case at the moment. What response, Mr. Speaker, can I expect from the DIS from this contribution? Mr. Speaker, I, together with anyone who stands up in support of my views on this issue, can expect to suffer any or all of the following: more phone surveillance and other surveillance, bursts to make their lives very difficult, CEDA to send their application for loan to vetting to the DIS. If they already have a CEDA loan, they can expect for targeted tracking. They can expect targeted raids on their businesses to check if they are committing some crime. They can expect souped up corruption charges. They can expect claims of membership to political factions. They can expect social media attacks by DIS agents masquerading as ordinary citizens, and God forbid, they may have to expect much more and much worse. It is for that reason, Mr. Speaker, that I must leave my honorable friends and this nation with a quote, the words of Martin Luther King Jr., who said, open quotes with the permission, Mr. Speaker.
New quote, don't remember?
Open quote. On some positions, cowardice asks the question, is it safe? Expediency asks the question, is it politic? And vanity comes along and asks the question, is it popular? But conscience asks the question, is it right? End quote.
Clarification?
Mr. Speaker, to my peers, let me warn you, your grandchildren will pay the price for any cowardice we display at this defining moment in our democracy. For me, Mr. Speaker, as I deliver this contribution, I know that it is not safe. I know that it is not politic. I know that it is not expedient. And it is not popular. But I'm convinced that it is right. And I ask every member of this House to look deep into their souls and silently answer them the question, what is whispering to you? What is whispering to you? Is that cowardice? Is that expediency? Is that vanity? Is that conscience? Just remember what Proverbs verse 27, chapter 27 says. And I quote, Mr. Speaker, with your permission, may I quote from that Proverbs verse, Mr. Speaker?
Please do quote, don't remember?
Open quotes. He who digs a pit will fall into it, and he who rolls a stone, it will come back on him. Close quotes. Methinks, Mr. Speaker, that this refers even to those who are standing close to those digging the pit or rolling the stone, but do nothing to stop the digging or the rolling. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May good things happen to this nation. Mr. Speaker, at this point, before I conclude, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to take any questions or clarification, Mr. Speaker. I believe I still have some time before I conclude, Mr. Speaker. I pause, Mr. Speaker.
speakers. Mr. Speaker. Make what you should have already. Mahukwa will Honorable Unity Dow. Ikamanya lone, woke. Me, Drake to Malan Lane. Maybe okay, Rotelka when Erika to Malan Lane. Relema Parliament, take away. GIS to pay to look home. Well, has in Laro. Maybe I demand why the city ama when the kiro went. The cars are raised, Canas of Juan as a Haruma. The Grohuma, they are Aranta as a sentle. Ruavana Rai Totota. The Tarama Parlamentama when I'm a Patia Bukiti. I want another email. Kilo Agua, Honorable Dow, Super. We are at a precipice. When I'm say to Unuragori, our Ragori, Ramon Taraha. Otaremodi Paragobi, Pozarwella Calemina, Yorongori Tatosi on a Candy, a precipice, Babu Butaway. We are suffering reputational harm. Our Ragor, Auria, Uragor is a man of Kalamahasama, when had some mason and has now Nakati. Here it happens in Kanye, Botswana, also it is a poor by you. When have concept that we beat our GIS bully. Our Ramon GIS is a bond as a Clarisang when I had seen Laru, Kirkimataway, or more to the country, or Twitter or Nalaman Parliament, the government. Obama would keep Ganawitz or Ventel, now Martin. Appear relevant about happy Buhai, Nairobitis of Puamima, Umagascaba, Mugatas. GIS will apply for possible one as a Clarisama Patama. Nama pata kusho nama pata ko penzi kusho like no worry the country only comes as some change we go here kila ko dela contribution ya hao ya o echere to na zone ni kan se hotel ma parliamentary change we kama ya zone ya no umaba khashata so wacho
thank you Mr. Speaker like we listen to how re kere ko re mo le tshitsing la le mena ga o ka gatela go pele wa go ela mo teng ga re ise re wele mo teng mme go tswa mo go rona gore a mme re boela go morago re mo le tshitsing la le mena reputational harm kana mahatshe a mangwe a lebella se se diragalang go mahatseng a mangwe be ba kanoka be ba ipotsa gore go diragalang gone ko ga gona gore ke a dumela tota gore ha re ka tlogela DIS e dira jaaka e dira makgotla a mantsintsi ya ne ke bua ka one a ile gore a na le dithata tsa gore ba ka e tshwara ba sa e tshware re tlong khala mahatshe a mang ka boamang la bohela no ra ke se bonta go ra ke se bonta se banta kana go toa se gang motho gore motho e leng gore go morakeng simega tshima ga e leng gore ga e robetse ga e ditane ga bona gore ga e rora hela le tsa go bona le taukoni
ba e tsitse mowa o betsa le mowa
nya ga ditse ka mowa ga ditse ka mowa mme re ka ra gore tota hela ba maru a re ska ra iphitlha ka bona gape dio tse dingwe go gore di dira ka bonya di ka bile dikeka tota hela o sa dumeleng gompieno jaana gore DIS gore ga gona go e laolang ya itaola ga ke itse gore tla batho go la se le go tema o tla ba le sego motho Mr. Speaker, I yield to and we can yeah, how Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
it takes courage for Parliamente wa party e busa a ene ka ditawa sina ya gore magaetso le parka ka ya gore rapa party a re ka raro party go gaisa le hatsi. It is important gore e bona gore sireletsa le hatsi la go ka gore ha re sa dire jang mo go dira ga le ka teno go bona ra mo go dira ga le ba le sa ba ga teng ka ntse ka motso go dira ga ngwa we. It has happened in many countries. I think honorable member is saying more was one of the who simulates Tulaga. Whatever one they have a job. After Basalomo Rabuka, Katsila, or Bassets Babamuma, I don't think we're relevant one. We have this time of the office. Basalomo Rabu Katsila in Dana, and we didn't know Basalomo Rabu, Solomon, Rawaka. Bona right to as a post antatero udirwa warrant of arrest emosena mkopoda urekilole ukwana kabuni uhoma ukunzi beno ngorwalira bane kitumela gore magogoa abatho mo right gore a go nna mme o tsara dipaka bile ke go gore le malum kra ka ba ile gore tota ba soletse maemo ida ba ba tsutimo ile go minister but ena against this because awami tsamama le semama nye ulomo ke mathata a ila o tsile le hatsi. It's another pandemic. Then if we don't deal it with it now that's la rona mo makateng bona ba rona ka magoko a gambeta ba ta phela madi down for us. So it was not a question. I wanted to profusely thank you, Honorable Dow, because I will not have that only proper brave men and women who can stand up and say, this is wrong. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable Speaker.
Mr. Speaker.
Procedure, Mr. Speaker. Honorable Minister Pule. What's the procedure?
The speaker is on the there's somebody on the floor. I am a clarification, elucidation, and procedure and a point of order. I would be able to go and have a look at northern overflow.
Members, please. Motho Kgabo Parliament wa Francis Town Borwa. Ke bone molato wa bana le go ga mokauleng wa gagwe motho Kgabo honorable cup kamarare ke go propose le feta much as it is not clearly stated on any portion of our standing orders. I think Honorable Minister will agree with me that it is something that is allowed.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker.
Please, Honorable Member from Gami, and then Honorable Dow will respond.
Honorable Speaker, Parliament Dow. Parliament Dow on our way hands in Tamalezi. I work for a Hasena Goyabuhatapa. If you Hasena Goyabulobe, Hasena Goyabu, Yabu, Kepela, Picaderta, and Amulone, Mokamuso. Siloseki, Silosino, or Kimula is almost to attack. Or a one hot hat, really Parliament, the one hot hat, and one hot hat, and the institutions that it will be carried out some like Salahasi. Or a hurricane, Peter, right, Peter, with the receiver. Rally pure, kill it, Hata, like Nnyaa, then incidents in one, red dancer and hats Laruna, going in jail. So said, the toilets are a syllable I have attack. Or a couple each of 100 day, motho, killer, and the channel of Sabat. The toilets are right at sea, Hasina Goyabu Hatapa. borehile ga se nako ya bolobe ke nako ya go ema ka dinako di bela lefatshe la rona lefatshe le le wela mo setemeneng ne ke re ke clarify hela go le kalo honorable speaker ke a leboga
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, nna ke tlhalose gore lephata la DIS ga se lephata la domgraga ebile a gona modomgraga o ka le ya manokeng ga le tsula molao o e leng gore o dirilwe ke parlamenteng ebile ga e se DIS ka moso e tsoga lephata le leng sontse re itse gore maphata otlhe a tsaya dithata mo molaong ga re bona go sa diragale sentle sontse re ye ko molaong re ipotsa gore a na re molao o ne ra o dira ole a lephata le ntse le o setse morago molao wa DIS wa bua tota gore ga ba ke ba dira sepe ba sokametse gope ebile thata ba sokametse mo dilong tsa dipolotiki gape o tla tlhaloganya go lephata le filwe dithata tse ditona ke sone se o bonang tsa fiwa batho le maphata go sumela ka tautona tota gore ba le lebelele mme ebile ne ke re tota hela ka gore ba ka o lengwe ba ntlatsa ne ke re bathong gompieno jaana ha ne re ka tlhoma that 9-member parliamentary committee e leng gore e mo molaong gompieno nke be re sa botse gore a DIS ke nnete ba rekile tautona loge kana gong ga se bone a ke re ka gore molao o re ha dithata o ha maparlamento a dithata go tlhodimela tiriso ya madi a DIS go tlhodimela tiro ya DIS go tlhodimela di-policy tsa DIS so ne ke re rona re tshwanetse gore re tseye tshwetso gore se re ya go se dira go botoka go sa boneng thata go na le sa boneng go tlhelele ke a itse gore Shalishando last year na bua mathata a mola gore go tlhomia ja mene ke re go botoka go bona loto go na le go sa boneng sepe jaanong ne ke re tota yeo e tswa mo go rona kgang ye nngwe e tshwanetse go tota hela re tlhaloganye ke gore beso ga gona ope nna kana tautona ka mse tautona kana wena re molutsi ka go mo parlamente yo sa tseng dithata go ga o bona lephata lengwe le lengwe kante mongwe le mongwe a dira selo a re o direla goromente o tshwanetse re o ipotsa gore dithata o di tsaya kae ka re gongwe go o di tsaya gore dithata o di tsaya kae ga o sa bone dilo sentle o lebelele molao o thata o ipotsa gore a mme lephata le ke ne ka lefa dithata ke le mo parlamente a ke ne ka le ga dithata go dira jaaka le dira ga e le gore gongwe ga o tlhaloganye sene ke sone se ke re commission of inquiry is important a commission is important gore gape gore tota re batho ba tla ba tlhaloganye gore a mme le dule mo seporong jaaka bontsi ba rona ba dumela so tota hela ka mahoko a ka lo Mr. Speaker. I've got 9 more minutes, Mr. Speaker. I will yield, sir. I yield, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Honorable Member for Mahala, former Silver Pequot East, followed by Honorable Member for Kansi North.
Chacha, I will Mr. Speaker.
Speaker, Honorable Unity Dow, here is a Sileno Contagion Nati. You got the bull by the horns. You have the things to do so. You are not going to don't apologize. You are wrong anyway. So,
It's well, to on the motion.
We have them. The bull by the horn. So Honorable Unit. Like in each presentation, respond to Nnyaa Mabability is ke a itse gore ba bangwe ba tlile go thaba ba boiha so e leng gore at least you started the discussion gore mongwe le mongwe a ska boiha. I thank you profusely, Honorable Dow. I thank you so much.
Directly, Mr. Speaker.
May I respond before he clarifies, Mr. Speaker?
Please, do you want to remember?
Mr. Speaker, I think it's really sad that there should even be a bull to hold by the horns. Who should poete e ka tshwarang ka dinaka? Molao o tlhamaletse molao ga ra o dirisa for so many years molao tota ha ntse re bapile lone so tota ha le ke nako a gore molao re o dirise mme ke a go leboga magokwao a gone go tota hela there should be no bull at all. Not the DCs should be no bull. Go gona ga o tshwanela go gona le poo. Thank you. I yield, sir. I yield.
Thank you.
Honorable Motho. For Hansi North, then Honorable Motho will come after him. Honorable Tite.
Thank you, Honorable Speaker. Thank you, they are there to play oversight. Honorable Leader of Salisando, who is later can I look power. I'm going to committee. We are caught away at Sobore, who talk quite a whole way. Did I work with Sinaba committee? What I was telling the power of some help for a Jangaro to do 1 hour. I thank you.
With your permission, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable Motho come in so that you respond to them both, Honorable Member.
Thank you, sir.
Honorable Motho.
Thank you, Dr. Unity Dow. Thank you so very much. First, I want to thank you for enlightening me about this act here, DIS. So, to be honest, I speak really the herekane, maybe you have really taught us. I heard you talking about the commission of prayer. Were you moving a motion or a dance? How I know you are really moving that motion. Secondly, you have to go parliament. I just Lemo Ayakaba committee by Demo and oversight DIS. Lastly, DIS. The current director, Unani, and is going to open the books that DIS for a audit way. So these things we need a commission to look at this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, mona botsa gore botlhokwa ba lekgotla le mapalamente keng. Botlhokwa bo ke gona gore dibuka di tla be di bulwa hape le ga bone. Ga nke ba botsa ope, ga nke ba khotlhora ba kwalle ope le kwalo ba botsa gore a ke boammaruri DIS e rekile senanne a ke boammaruri DIS senanne ka gore ba tlebe bana le tshwanelo molao wa ba tota di ba ba patetse ga o re kope molao ga o re kope gore a re tsene mo lekgotleng wa re go tla nna lekgotla la mapalamente ba roba bongwe ba batla lebellang dibuka tsa DIS ba batla lebella tsamaiso ya DIS ba tla lebellang di policy tsa DIS ha ke so tota hela go ntse ja na o botsa gore a ke move a motion go na le tsamaiso ya go move a motion e tla re ntse re bua mo malatsing a 15 ya mongwe le mongwe tla bantsa ka megopolo mme ga go reye gore ke motion re sa leshando na bua nana ka megopolo e mentsinyana ga go reye ke di-motion di ka nna tsa hella di-motion kana nnyaa mme hela ne ke tsaya gore tota potso ke gore a o teng mo palamente yo dumelang gore dis ga e a tswa mo seporong o ne a bua gape honorable Motaosane o ne a bua gona gore o mošwa yo o ne a rile o tla bula dibuka ga ke batle go bua ka motho o sa kgone go ipuelela fa ke batla go bua ka lephata ka gore ga ke itse gore ke eng a sa kgona commission of inquiry tla supa gore ke mang mo paturung e o e leng gore ke ene a buseditseng dio ko morago mme hela a re tseng thoje re shineng at the DRS re bone gore a ntse e tswere jaaka re rile e dire ka 2008 Kgabo, I have 2 minutes only left, Mr. Speaker. I would like to conclude.
Honorable Dow, you did not clarify on the issue of Honorable Leader of the House or
gore molao ga go bona gore ga o tshwane melao e pehela gore o leka tota gore mongwe le mongwe a nne le seabe molao wa re tautona a gakololwa kante mo bogakoloding ka in consultation with the leader of the house o tla tlhoma lekgotlale mme lekgotlale le tla nna le batho ba le 9 mme gore ba kae ba opposition ba kae ba ruling party go tla laola percentage mo parlamente so go ra gore se ke se kopang ke gona gore re sa leshando le tautona ba kopane gape ganye e botlhokwa ba kopane gape ba se ba helana pelo a lekgotlale le nneteng mme Mr. Speaker, I just want to conclude because a lot of people talked about courage. I want to conclude my presentation by quoting Franklin D. Roosevelt, and this is what the quote says. Open quote, Mr. Speaker. I've got 30 seconds. Courage is not the absence of fear, but rather the assessment that something else is more important than fear. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the assessment that some things are more important than fear. Let us make sure that this nation gets what we promised, what we keep on promising all of us, that we will rule with the rule of law. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honorable Dow. Thank you.